So good morning to our friends joining us abroad. Good evening. Welcome to Merage Talks. Today, I would like to introduce a very dear friend of the Merage family and the Merage Institute, Jacob Siegel. He is the founder of Investors Research Group and the co-chair of Southern California Israel Chamber of Commerce. Jacob, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us and hosting us again, Christy. Thank you again to the Merage Institute. I'll repeat, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you all for joining for another Merage Southern California talk. Thank you, Dr. Newman, and thank you, Dr. Ido Netanyahu, for accepting our invitation and being part of this program. My name is Jacob Siegel. Like Christy said, I'm a co-executive director of the Southern California Israel Chamber of Commerce. We are non-governmental, non-profit, non-political platform, and our mission is basically to facilitate trade, commerce, and innovation between Southern California and Israel. This year, we are celebrating 45 years since Operation Entebbe, and we are delighted to have Professor Boaz Dvir to be our main speaker. About the program today, I'll introduce Consul General Hillel Newman, and then I'll introduce, and he will have his remarks. Then I'll introduce Professor Boaz Dvir, and he will make the presentation, the lessons from the history most daring mission. And then Dr. Newman will introduce Dr. Ido Netanyahu for his remarks, and then we'll have questions and comments towards the end. Let me start. My introduction will be very short because we like to leave a lot of room for questions and comments. Dr. Hillel Newman was appointed the Consul General of Israel to the Pacific Southwest in July 2019. Dr. Newman has over 20 years of diplomatic service for Israel. He served as ambassador to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Dr. Newman holds a PhD in Jewish history, was a professor at Bar-Ilan University, and he speaks a lot of South African accent. Dr. Newman, when we start with you for opening with your remarks for this program.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, the Merage Institute. And thank you to all the partners. Thank you, Ido Netanyahu, for joining. And of course, the key speaker, Boaz. Good evening, good morning for us, good day for us. Thank you all. Just a few words of my impressions or opening words about Entebbe. And I mean, we all know that it's one of the most heroic escapades, operations that was ever done by the state of Israel. And I will never forget that I was a young teenager at the time. I was only 12 years old. And I'll never forget how my mother woke me up when the news came out. It was in the early morning, if I'm not mistaken, and my mother came running into my room and woke me up, and she said, "You won't believe what Israel has done." So, and that's embedded in me since I was 12 years old. And it's really amazing, not only the heroic operation itself, but of course, the implications of the operation. And that's what I'd like to spend 2 minutes talking about. What are the long-term lessons to be learned from Entebbe? Of course, we all remember Yoni Netanyahu and the sacrifice that the Netanyahu family paid in this operation. And we, of course, sympathize with the family. But at the same time, we remember what lessons were learned from Entebbe, which are eternal lessons. The first lesson, I would say, is the aspect of no negotiations with terrorists. Unfortunately, some governments have, during some years, have done some kind of negotiation with terrorists, but I think that lesson is eternal, that we do not negotiate with terrorists. The second thing is the daring aspect of the state of Israel. We should always remain like the Palmach. We should always remain daring and heroic in order to achieve what we need to achieve. Third aspect is not to rely on outside forces. I mean, that's been a principle since we were re-established in 1948. But we cannot rely on outside
Progress.
forces or even thought of relying on Idi Amin in order to save.
I think you're muted now.
Hillel, you got muted.
I think you're suddenly muted, Hillel.
Sorry. So I don't know where it was muted all of a sudden, but I'll just say that one of the last lessons is that Israel can reach anywhere. That's one of the most important aspects, that our reach and our dare must always remain vigilant and on the edge. I thank you for inviting me to open, and I'm sure this will be a very interesting discussion, and we will forever cherish the knowledge, the lessons of Entebbe, and also the sympathy with the families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Consul General. It is my pleasure now to introduce Professor Boaz Dvir. Professor Boaz Dvir is a Penn State University assistant professor at the Donald Belisario College of Communication, and he is director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Institute. Boaz is an award-winning filmmaker and author. His short documentary, How Special Ops Become Central to the War on Terror, was produced for the New York Times Magazine. And his short on child poverty, The Land of Eternal Spring, was premiered at over 20 films festivals, for which he won numerous awards. Today's topic is lessons from the history most daring rescue mission, and Boaz, take it from here.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Hillel. Thank you, Ido Netanyahu, for joining us. Thank you, Christy and the Merage Foundation and all of you for joining us today. We don't have time, I'll tell you right up front, no matter how generous you are by giving me as much time as needed to go over all the lessons. There are so many lessons to Entebbe. And the beauty of it is that you can draw your own lessons as well, right? It can go in many different directions. But I'll give you examples. I'll give you some examples, but we'll get to that in a minute. What I want to do first is just talk about the other part of the title, which is the daring part. You know, this was a daring mission. And you know, I'm claiming in the title, perhaps maybe history's most daring rescue mission. So I better, you know, back that up. I better explain. And by the way, Hillel, you know, this event left a very similar mark on me, and I was in a very similar situation. I was 9 years old, you were 12, and my dad walked into our room, my brother and I shared the room, and saying something similar. He said, Tzahal, you know, the IDF did it. That's all he had to say, and we knew immediately, you know, and we just jumped out of beds. We ran around like crazy. We couldn't believe it. So it has left a mark, but it's worth revisiting and seeing it again, right? Even if you know the story. Again, I want to show you why it was so daring. So on the morning of June 27th, 1976, Air France flight 139 takes off from Tel Aviv. Not a big deal, a routine flight. Most of the passengers are Jewish on this flight, right? Many of them were visiting Israel and were going back to France. And many were Israelis who were going to Europe, perhaps elsewhere. Dora Black, of course, she was going to go on from Paris and fly to the United States to go to her son's wedding, etc. And as they get on the plane, the captain announces that they're going to make an unscheduled layover. Now, can you imagine such a thing? I don't know if any of you ever been in such a situation. They stopped doing this, by the way, after Operation Thunderbolt. But up until 1976, this was common. You know, if one of you remembers that, I didn't fly before 1976, so I don't know. And I can't imagine such a thing where you buy a non-stop flight ticket to go somewhere, and as you get on a plane, they tell you, we're going to stop somewhere else to pick up more passengers. What? Now, this was particularly upsetting for two additional reasons. It would be upsetting anyway. If I'm flying, let's say from Philadelphia to LA, and I paid for a nonstop flight, and they're announcing we're going to stop in Chicago, I'm going to be a little miffed. These passengers were really upset, and here's why. First of all, any kind of unscheduled layover added risk to the journey. This was the age of the hijack. At the time, throughout the globe, there were 3 hijacks every month. Every month, 3 skyjackings. Can you imagine living in such a world? You know, we're upset about what's going on. We have plenty to complain. And of course, you know, I'm not going to take away from anything like COVID and what we've just seen in Israel. But you got to admit, overall, we've made some improvements too. I mean, 3 hijackings a month. So that was one concern. Any kind of layover is problematic. But this one was particularly worrisome. They were going to stop in Athens, which had notoriously lacked security. People knew that. The Israelis knew that. Tourists knew that. And terrorists knew that too. And in fact, several of the hostages, the former hostages that I interviewed, told me that when they heard that they were going to stop in Athens, they looked at each other and said, uh-oh, we're going to get skyjacked. They actually thought that. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. And those 4 terrorists, 2 Germans, 2 Palestinians, hijacked the plane initially to Benghazi. And in Israel, there was the fear, based on previous similar engagements, that the plane would then refuel in Benghazi, but not stay there and instead come back to Tel Aviv, which is frightening. And Israel, you know, didn't want to deal with that, but it was a better option. At least they were coming back to Lod, to Tel Aviv, and it could be dealt with. But instead, the plane did not come back to Tel Aviv. It flew all the way down to Entebbe, which seemingly in the eyes of the terrorists, in the eyes of Idi Amin and the Ugandans and most of the world at the time, put a military option immediately out of the question. It was simply too far, right? So now we're starting to talk about the first daring aspect of the mission. It seemed impossible because it was too far away, just technically too far away. But second, it wasn't just that it was far away. The Israelis would then have to fly over mostly enemy territory to get them. Very dangerous situation, right? Not fully. Some of the countries along the way might have been neutral, or, you know, Kenya certainly was friendly, but for the most part, you're talking about several land masses of sworn enemies. So this already put the situation in a new stratosphere, in a new realm for the Israelis. How do we deal with this? This is brand new. It's too far away. We might not have a military option. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean that they went to Entebbe, to Uganda, right? It means that at a minimum, they think they have the support of the local government and the military. Or they know that they have it. You see, the Israelis were not sure. On one hand, Idi Amin was a former ally of Israel, still walked around, showed up at the airport, by the way, with Israeli parachute wings that he got in Israel, that he never owned, he never parachuted, but he got those wings. So he had a history, he had friends in Israel. But at the same time, since Israel had refused to sell him advanced weaponry and fighter jets, he had broken with Israel and squarely put himself on the Palestinian side, on the Arab side. So he had made very strong statements against Israel and expressed sympathy with Hitler and other notorious anti-Semites. So a dangerous figure. It wasn't clear, though, to what degree was he in cahoots with the terrorists. That was something that had to be found out. It wasn't very clear either right away what the terrorists planned to do and what they wanted. You see, they hijacked the plane on Sunday morning. They arrive in Entebbe that night, but technically Monday morning, or, you know, speaking, but that night. And it wasn't until Tuesday morning that the terrorists finally announced their demands. And here's what they wanted. They wanted the release of 53 prisoners, most of whom were former terrorists. 40 of them were in Israel, and 13 supposedly were in 4 other countries: France, Germany, Switzerland, and Kenya. We know now, and we knew then, of course, the Israelis knew then, that the prisoners that were demanding release from Kenya were not in Kenya at the time, but were in fact in Israel already. So now that it's, by the way, they wanted $5 million too, which was very common back then. Most of these negotiations had some sort of a monetary aspect to them as well, which is quite strange to think about, right, today, such a different environment. But that was the case. They wanted $5 million. The $5 million was not the issue. The issue was, of course, releasing terrorists, releasing terrorists. That's a problem for Israel. Second problem, coordinating the release of these others from these other countries. So everything was pointing towards some sort of a negotiation process. It was pointing that way. Israel obviously was reluctant to do that, was very reluctant to do that. So Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister at the time, was asking, do we have a military option? Is there a military option? And Shimon Peres, who was the defense minister at the time, and by the way, a bit of a controversial defense minister because he didn't have the military background that most of Israel's defense ministers tended to have. But nonetheless, a respected figure for his strategic thinking and actions. He insisted right away that there was a military option, but he didn't know what it was. So he asked his chief of staff, Mota Gur, and the military establishment to come up with some ideas. And they came up with all sorts of ideas, including, and I'm not making this up or exaggerating, invading a good chunk of Uganda, invading it, sending thousands of soldiers and taking it over. That was one option. And I'm going to come back to that when we talk about the lessons. So needless to say, neither Mota Gur nor Yitzhak Rabin were very convinced. They were also staring at two huge issues. Number one, the terrorists said that starting on the Thursday, so remember, the hijacking happens on Sunday. We find out what the terrorists want on Tuesday, and they're telling us that if by noon on Thursday, these demands are not met, they will start executing the hostages. And even though 50 passengers boarded the plane in Athens, still the majority of the 250 hostages are Jewish. Only about 80 or so are Israeli, but the majority are Jewish. So quite a tough situation. And the internal pressure in Israel is immense, There's severe cries for negotiations. It wasn't a case of the Jewish population in Israel saying, we understand, we don't negotiate with terrorists, let's see what we can do. It wasn't like that at all. It was the families, the friends of the hostages, supporters, marching on the prime minister's private residence and demanding that negotiations take place. And without seeing a clear military path and facing the internal pressure and being a military man himself who saw that this would be extremely risky at best, Yitzhak Rabin announced on the Thursday morning that Israel would negotiate. And he sent one of his generals, General Ze'evi, known as Gandhi, better known as Gandhi, to Paris to conduct these negotiations. Now, was this a ploy? It was not a ploy. This was not a ploy. These were real negotiations that took place. So real that the Chacham Ze'evi, the man sent to conduct the negotiations, didn't know until after the operation that his negotiations weren't ongoing and completely real. And Yitzhak Rabin and the government and the cabinet kept this option open even as the planes carrying the commandos were flying to Entebbe. Even then, that negotiation option was kept open. So I want to come back to that too when we talk about lessons. I want to come back. That's another point I really want to come back to, is talking about the negotiations. But as these negotiations take shape, suddenly a plan does emerge. And it involves sending far fewer soldiers than was planned in some of the other options. Instead of 1,000 or 2,000, you're talking about maybe 100 or 200, right? It was going to be a quick strike using the element of surprise. But it was still very daring. It was a very daring attempt because of what I mentioned before, but here's another reason. There wasn't a lot of time. There wasn't a lot of time. Forget a lot of time. I'll rephrase that. There wasn't sufficient time in the commandos' minds to prepare a halfway decent operation. The operation took place basically Saturday night, technically, a few minutes into Sunday morning, which made the operation be a July 4th operation. But really, it happened Saturday night. Saturday morning, the leadership of the Sayeret Matkal, the unit, the Sayeret Matkal was not the only unit. It's known as Da unit. It was not the only unit that participated. They also had paratroopers. But it was the main unit. It was the unit that attacked the old terminal and rescued the hostages. It was the unit that Yoni Netanyahu led. The leadership, the other officers, other than Yoni Netanyahu and Mookie Betzer, who were the top two leaders, Yoni being the top and Mookie leading their anti-terrorism efforts. But the other officers met with them and told them, you got to call this off. We are not ready. They've told me this. Several of them have told me this. It's well documented. We're not ready. There isn't enough time. And the information that they received initially wasn't even close to being enough. Now, you know the story about how the Israelis had the blueprints to the old terminal where the terrorists and the Ugandans held the hostages. You know that story because Solel Boneh built it, right? And Solel Boneh had the blueprints. And I believe that's a true story. I've not seen anything to show me otherwise. But it's insufficient. You may know what the building looks like, and that helps you. It's better than not knowing. But you still need to know where are the terrorists, how many terrorists are there, where are they keeping the hostages, how are they keeping the hostages, what kind of weapons do they have, what kind of explosives do they have, where are the Ugandan soldiers positioned? I can go on and on and on and on. So you need real intelligence on the ground. That real intelligence started to emerge on Wednesday. Interesting, the day before Israel agreed to negotiate. What happened on Wednesday? On Wednesday, 47 hostages were released. They were released because on the ground, there was a French Jewish Holocaust survivor named Michel Cogeot. I'm making a documentary about him. You can see the poster behind me, who became the liaison between the terrorists and the hostages and negotiated medicine, better conditions, you name it, and also convinced the terrorists that you must release the vulnerable hostages. Who are they? The sick, the old, the little ones, right? The children. And they agreed to do it, but only from among the non-Israeli population. So they released 47 hostages who were then brought by another Air France plane, flies to Entebbe, picks them up, takes them back to Paris. And then who interviews them? Not so much the French authorities, they're not planning anything, but the Mossad. The Mossad interviewed these 47 released hostages to get intelligence, to know. And they got a better picture of what was going on, obviously. Who was there, who was not there, who were the terrorists involved. They knew these guys. I mean, these guys were infamous. Wilfred Boza, I mean, this was the creator of the Revolutionary Center. He was the leader of this operation. And he participated in everything. You name it, he had a hands in it, including lending support, by the way, to the Munich massacre in 1972. So these were well-known, terrorists that the Mossad knew about. But I'm sticking with the point that this was an extremely daring operation. And I'm getting to another big point. What the hostages told the Mossad agents made them issue a recommendation against an operation. And here's why. It wasn't just, two points that came out of it, actually. It wasn't, there are two very big points. Number one, it became very clear on that Wednesday that not only was Idi Amin and the Ugandans in cahoots with the terrorists, but they were working in tandem with them. That his soldiers were there to keep the hostages in and keep anybody else out. Yes, that his soldiers were involved and that there were dozens of them. So that's a problem. Now you're talking about a different operation than simply going in and extrapolating hostages. Up until then, no one had done that. No one had ever gone into an enemy territory to do that, as the US would do, by the way, 4 years later, trying to rescue the hostages in Iran. But it had not been done before 1976. This is a totally different operation than going up against terrorists. Now you're going up against a whole country. Now you are taking action against a sovereign state. Now you're dealing with a military, with an army that has a lot of weapons, that has the control tower, that may have tanks and fighter planes that they got from the Soviets. It's a totally different situation. It's much more dangerous, and the stakes are much higher. And the second thing they heard was equally troublesome. The released hostages said that Idi Amin and Wilfred Boza and the Palestinian terrorists have all told them that they rigged the old terminal where they kept the hostages. Meaning, they booby-trapped it. If an assault unit attacks it, even if they're able to kill many of the terrorists and many of the soldiers, even if they have the element of surprise, the whole place can still easily and instantly erupt in flames, blow up, killing everybody, all the hostages, all the soldiers. Well, practically, but certainly the ones running in. So suddenly, I mean, this becomes just, what they thought was very challenging to begin with now is 10 times more challenging. So what changed then? How did Israel then decide to go ahead and risk it? I mean, I think I illustrated how daring this was. It was unprecedented, but not just unprecedented in a new territory, unprecedented in a new galaxy, like a whole new type of operation that neither Israel nor any other commander unit had ever attempted, with multiple complications and so many things that can go wrong. Not to mention that, again, if you get there at the end, and even if you've done everything just right somehow, and you somehow got there, and you surprise them, and you kill them, still everybody can blow up, right? Now, to mention, if you don't have real life information, last minute, they can move the hostages. You can get there, storm into the old terminal, get in there, and they move them. They're nowhere, they're not even there. And then what do you do? So what changed? What really changed? How did Israel proceed? After Israel announced that they were willing to negotiate, the same Michel Cogeot convinces the terrorists to release all the non-Israeli hostages, which was 100 hostages. We're talking about 100 hostages. And they released them. And he is allowed to leave. He's a French Jew. They didn't hold the Jews back. They only held the Israelis back, who were Jewish, of course. So, I mean, but still, they released non-Israeli Jews. He could go. He initially did not want to go. He wanted to stay with the Israelis. He wanted to stay there till the end. But Ilan Artuv, Dora Bloch's son, who was a former diplomat in East Africa, of all places, and was kind of the spokesperson for the Israelis, not just during Entebbe, but for years later, for the hostages, he convinced him to go. Because Ilan Artuv had a feeling that Israel was planning something, despite the obstacles. And he knew that Michel Cogeot had the kind of information that the Israelis desperately needed. Why? Because Michel Cogeot had unique access. The terrorists trusted him. He became their friend. He was there with them everywhere. He got to see where they were. He got to hear all their conversations. He spoke multiple languages. I mean, they told him things. He knew. So he agreed to go, thinking, by the way, that he would speak with the French. He was convinced that the French maybe would launch a rescue operation. And when he gets to Paris, he actually calls the foreign ministry of Paris, saying, listen, I'm a released hostage. I got crucial information I want to give you. And here's what they said to him. listen, it's Friday afternoon, no one's around, call back on Monday. But the Mossad approached him and interviewed him. And they were very happy speaking to him. They ended up really spending the whole day with him. He gave him documents, he drew diagrams from them, he gave him all the information. Because not only was this guy uniquely qualified to deliver this information and had access to it, he was also very precise, he kept notes, he was prepared for this, and he was credible. And here's the key thing he told the Israelis that really allowed this to move forward. He said, look, they did not rig the terminal. And so the Mossad agent asked him, how do you know that? How can you be so sure? He said, 2 reasons. I have 2 reasons to know that they didn't rig it. I'll tell you why. Number 1, the soldiers stayed on the floor above. There's the old terminal, it has 2 stories. The hostages were below. Amin's soldiers, 20 of them, stayed in the floor above. That's where they slept. Idi Amin was a ruthless dictator and a murderer, no question about it, a war criminal. But he loved his soldiers, and he would not have done that to them, and they would not have done that to themselves. So that's 1. Second, Michel told him, I checked the boxes that the terrorists claim were booby trap, that had explosives in them. And they don't. They're just there for show. There are no explosives. You're good to go. And so that gave Israel the confidence to proceed. Among other factors, I mean, this is not the only one. There's many other factors that I can get into, including, by the way, a Mossad agent who was on the ground in Entebbe to check and make sure that the hostages were still there, and checked on Saturday. She did not have the same access that Michel had to all this other information, but she was able to say, yes, the hostages are still there. The new terminal, which was adjacent to the old terminal, was fully functioning, by the way. They just kept flying out of there. Tourists kept coming in and out. The souvenir shop was up and running. What a surreal scene, right? So Israel launches the operation, and this is the part you all know. I don't need to tell you what happens. It's a incredible, heroic, tragic tale that makes me tear up every time I think about it for all those reasons. You know, I still am so sad about, I'm still broken up to this day about Yoni Netanyahu's death. My love to you and your family. I mean, what a hero he was. What a hero he was. And what a legacy, what a spirit. And of course, you know, other hostages died too in the crossfire. Mainly, you know, a couple jumped up when the Israeli soldiers tell them to stay down. But the Israelis rescued more than 100 hostages and brought them home safely. It was remarkable. It was unbelievable. And yes, it was the most daring operation of its kind at the time. And it changed a lot. And now I want to get to the lessons. Now I want to share the lessons of the operation with you. Before I jump into it, does anyone have any question about the operation itself or the daring aspect of it? Any questions, anything you'd like me to clarify?
Boaz, let's leave this towards the end. So
okay,
yeah,
great.
yeah.
Great. So I will continue with what are some of the lessons we can learn, right? So you got to look at the context, first of all, the lessons. It depends on who's learning the lesson. So let's begin with the Americans. We're in the United States of America. So what were the lessons to the Americans? The Americans drew one big giant lesson from the operation that really, it blows my mind. Now, I don't know if they knew it at the time. I can't tell you, I wasn't there. Did they actually know that they were drawing a lesson and developing a new strategy out of that lesson that would last until 2021? I don't know, but that's what happened. That lesson that the Americans learned from this is with us today. So much so, I'll tell you how much, that when President Trump got into office, he very quickly, as you may recall, and efficiently, or, you know, however you want to look at it, swiftly dismantled many of Obama's policies. Either was able to get rid of them through executive orders, or defund them, or took them on and tried to fight them. In some cases, maybe succeeding, in other cases, less so. But he was, objectively speaking, factually speaking, going after Obama's policies, right? Wasn't the only thing he did, but that was something he did. And yet, he kept intact, fully, a strategic policy that Obama had inherited himself, because it's been there since 1976, but Obama, just like his predecessors, continued to expand. Obama himself had expanded it. And Biden now, who also, as you can see, also wants to dismantle a lot of what Trump did, is not touching this either. And that is the use of special operation forces in the war against terrorism around the globe. The United States has special operations in at least 80 countries right now. And most of what they do is under the radar. We don't really hear about it. On occasion, there's a high-profile assassination or something happens and it makes the news. And we've seen that too, plenty of times. But that policy was born straight out of Entebbe, straight out of Entebbe. In fact, when they kill Osama bin Laden, if you look at the planning for it, a good chunk of it was based on Operation Thunderbolt. And this idea really just clicked with the Americans so much of, wait a second, we can use special forces, we can create new kinds of special forces, and we can deploy them around the globe to take strategic strikes to advance our interests against terrorism and in other ways as well. This was remarkable. In fact, so remarkable, and it resonated so much with the Americans, that despite the fact that their first big mission was a colossal failure, the Iran hostage crisis rescue attempt, the Americans still stuck with this. They created the Delta Force directly as a result of Operation Thunderbolt, and then they, even though Operation, the first operation that the Delta Force did, again, just, I mean, it was sad. They still continued with it. So now what I want to do is share this film I made, this short film. I made it with a company called Retro Report. We originally made it for the New York Times, but then we made a shorter version for PBS. PBS wanted it too. I'm going to show you the shorter version simply because there's so much to discuss. So this version is called Send in the Special Ops Forces. So give me just a minute and I will play it for you.
President after president has expanded the footprint of U.S. special operations.
No enemy stands a chance against our special forces.
How did special ops become so central to America's warfighting?
Can special ops keep up the pace?
The story of how America became so dependent on these forces began with an unusual event almost 5 decades ago, when someone yelled fire on a crowded plane.
Everybody turns around to look at what's happening there, and there are 2 people who each have a hand grenade in their hand and a gun.
Suddenly, we heard on the intercom a man speaking in English with a German accent who said that we've changed directions, but if we'll behave and follow instructions, nothing bad will happen to us.
At the end, he said, "Thank you for flying Air France," and, hung up.
The plane had been hijacked by a group of German radicals and members of a Palestinian liberation organization.
They want the freedom of 53 prisoners. If Israel and the other countries accept to release those prisoners, no harm will be done to us, they'll release us, and if not, it'll be different.
And he finished it with the words, "Now you know how the mind of a crazy German revolutionary works."
2,800 miles later, the plane touched down in Entebbe, Uganda. where the hostages were greeted by its leader, Idi Amin.
He says, look, these terrorists have full support of the Ugandan people. Now the building is surrounded with Ugandan soldiers armed with machine guns. So, I asked my father what's going to happen. He told me, we're probably dead meat because Israel never negotiates. He even made the argument, it's way too far for Israel to intervene.
Soon, 40 released in an attempt to entice the Israeli government to the table. Olivier Kojo was among them.
Alors c'était assez dangereux. Vous avez quoi? Des grenades et des boîtes d'explosifs.
Israeli intelligence, secretly planning an operation, was waiting for them.
They started asking me all kinds of questions like, how high is the grass out there? Can you see the lake from where you are? Which way do the doors open? Is it wall, window?
We never had to plan an operation which is so far away with so many soldiers. I was not afraid of being killed or being hurt. I was afraid of failure.
3 days later, lead pilot Joshua Shani guided a squadron of 4 Hercules C-130s through the darkness toward Entebbe Airport.
We landed normal landing, no big deal. In the middle of the runway, paratroopers jumped from the door. Their job was to conquer the control tower. I made the turn, I saw the terminal, it was quiet. The Entebbe situation was based on surprise.
Out the back of the Israeli plane, heavily armed commandos quickly drove a convoy that included a Mercedes chosen to resemble Amin's.
It took seconds and they were inside the building.
Our soldiers were beginning to come in. Then I thought that there would be bullets flying and I covered myself with a mattress.
Within 51 minutes, the commandos had killed all the terrorists and Ugandan soldiers guarding the building. Then, they rushed the 102 remaining hostages onto the awaiting planes.
After we were satisfied, my instruction was, take off, you don't wait, go, go.
4 hostages were killed, as was the commando's leader, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu. But the world saw the bold operation as an extraordinary success.
Immediately you saw a trend. I'm talking about real countries like the US, of course, UK, Germany, Italian, all came to learn. It was like the whole world said, wow, they have chutzpah, these guys. They are damn good. Entebbe gave a green light to governments that there is maybe another way and not just to surrender.
One of those governments was the United States.
Look at this. One American, blindfolded, handcuffed. Today in the courtyard of the American Embassy in Tehran. He and 60-some others still held hostage and threatened in a country gone out of control.
Dozens of Americans had been taken hostage as the Islamic Revolution swept through Iran. And President Jimmy Carter's administration looked to Entebbe for a solution.
Operation Eagle Claw attempted to project power and special operations forces deep into enemy hostile territory, but while it was sort of in the same spirit as Entebbe, there were a lot of moving parts for Operation Eagle Claw.
The daring plan called for U.S. Delta Force commandos to land in the Iranian desert, then sneak into the city of Tehran to free the hostages.
I knew it was going to be complex and really, really high risk. But, if the president was going to order us to go, then you salute smartly and you go.
But the mission lacked Entebbe's precision. Planners hadn't accounted for the region's punishing dust storms. Mission helicopters were crippled. Then there was a crash.
Good evening. We tried, we failed, and we have paid a price.
Left behind in the desert of Iran are the bodies of 8 American servicemen, 7 U.S. aircraft, and many questions.
To the families of those who died and who were wounded, I want to express the admiration I feel for the courage of their loved ones and the sorrow that I feel personally for their sacrifice.
In response to the failure, the U.S. made sweeping changes over the next decade to how these operations were conducted, increasing their funding, beefing up the forces, and putting them under a central command.
In 1980, there were some 6,000 to 8,000 special operations people. Today's count is over 69,000. Unbelievable growth. Because of Eagle Claw, we find ourselves much better prepared today. Many things would not have happened without that failure.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden.
But as special operations have become crucial to U.S. military strategy, concerns have also emerged that the forces are being overused and sometimes put in harm's way without a clear strategic goal.
Special operations should not be the panacea for every kind of difficulty that we find ourselves around the world facing, to include terrorism. We should not get to the point that we become the solution for the United States military.
Okay, so I mean, when we talk about lessons, by the way, were you able to see it from the beginning, or was there a glitch in the beginning? You were able to see it right from the start, the whole video? Oh, good. Excellent. Oh, great. So, when we talk about lessons, there's also levels, right? There's the big lesson, and then we can break it down underneath, like the pros and the cons, for instance, of the strategy that the US still deploys. But we don't have time to that. We want to get to a couple more lessons, right? So let's talk about a touchy one. Which is this whole idea of negotiations. Israel has the image, and probably for the most part rightly so, of not negotiating with terrorists, because Israel takes a very strong stance against terrorists, right? And that kind of comes with it. But it isn't necessarily true that Israel doesn't negotiate with terrorists. Israel does, always has. Just now, Israel just negotiated with Hamas. The ceasefire was negotiated between Israel and a sworn enemy of the Jewish state, a self-proclaimed and internationally categorized terrorist organization, Hamas, right? No matter what you might think of it, it's a terrorist organization. So Israel does negotiate. And you might say, well, maybe Entebbe was the first time and Israel had no choice. Actually not. There were two main terrorist organizations that conducted this hostage crisis, right? One, as I mentioned, was the German Revolutionary Cells. The other was a Palestinian entity called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was the first Palestinian group to use skyjacking as a mean to achieve its goals. And its first spectacular hijacking took place in 1968, when they hijacked an El Al plane, believe it or not, an El Al plane, and took it to Algiers. And that hostage crisis lasted 40 days. It was a very long one. I mean, it was very long, at a week in Entebbe. Can you imagine? 40 days. And at the end, Israel capitulated. Israel negotiated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and Israel gave up the 16 prisoners it held who were they were terrorists, right? Not former, they were terrorists, and released them in return for the released hostages. So negotiations do take place in all sorts of ways. But maybe we shouldn't fear them so much, maybe we shouldn't fear them so much. Maybe this notion of never negotiating is really, maybe the lesson, maybe that's not what really it's about, because who do you often negotiate? You negotiate with your enemy. In Israel's case, unfortunately, and also in America's case, unfortunately, increasingly, the enemies are terrorist groups. So sometimes you have to negotiate with them. It's unsavory. I wish we didn't. I don't enjoy it. I don't even condone it, but I accept that it's something that we have to do, have done, and will probably continue have to do. So then what is it then? What is it? Where does Israel differentiate itself? And I think the lesson there is not so much that Israel doesn't negotiate, because it negotiated here and it was ready. Man, I mean, if Michel Cogio had decided to stay after all and had not convinced Mota Gur and Rabin that there were no explosives at the old terminal, Maybe they don't give it the go-ahead. Maybe it doesn't even happen. Maybe they actually negotiate and release those, 50 or so terrorists. Germany, France, Switzerland, they all agreed to do it. Kenya, as I said, had no say because those prisoners were already in Israel. So maybe it will happen. But instead, I think, well, Israel, to me, the lesson is that Israel stands up to bullies. That was really it. Israel stands up to bullies. If you're going to be a bully, we may negotiate with you, but we're also going to get you. We're not only going to go to you, we're going to go after you. Whereas up until then, in the age of the hijack, almost all of these instances where people hijacked planes ended with the hijackers getting what they wanted, which often was money. A lot of it happened here in the United States. Many of these planes were taken to Cuba. And often, the ransom was paid, much like we see today with, Bitcoin being paid for ransom online. Very similar, right? I mean, if you think about it, that's a good analogy. That is a lesson. What we're seeing constantly with these hacks online is companies, as we just saw last week with the pipeline, we just saw it, pay the ransom. Maybe we should stop, because the more you pay off, the more you give them what they want, the less you stand up to them, the more they're going to demand, the more they're going to spread, the more they're going to do. Maybe we need to say it's illegal to pay the ransom, and the United States government should step in, and maybe the Israeli government can help and find a way to stand up to these online bullies. Maybe that's a lesson we can learn from Entebbe. Just an idea, right? And that's what Israel did. Israel said enough's enough. Enough meeting all the demands. Enough doing what they're asking for. We'll negotiate. Yeah, we'll negotiate in earnest, but we're going to explore at the same time a military option. And if we have it and it's viable, we're going to take it, because enough is enough, and we're going to stand up to these bullies. And I think that's a great lesson from Entebbe for all of us. How am I doing in terms of time? How many more lessons can I give before we take questions?
Let's try to summarize. Let's try to summarize it, Boaz. Thank you.
Okay, then I'll summarize. The summary is that I jotted down a list of lessons, and I have about, I'm still scrolling down, about 15 of them. And there are more, and I shared basically just a couple with you. The last one I'll mention really, really quick, I won't dwell on it, is how vital it is to have intelligence, to have information on the ground. Israel had sent a reconnaissance plane to fly over Entebbe and take photos. They sent a Mossad agent to work at the new terminal and kind of look and see what was going on in the old terminal. But what really ultimately made the difference was the information they received from the 150 released hostages, in particular Michel Kojot, who gave Israel real credible, real-time intelligence that Israel could use to build the most daring rescue of all times. What I encourage you to do, there's a lot out there about Entebbe, is to read, watch, see, give it some thought, and see what lessons you can come up with for yourself, for the United States, for the whole of human race, because there's so much there to mine and learn from. It's just incredible. And I'm honored to be able to be here and discuss it with you. And I guess I will now take some questions.
Well, before that, before I'll give you my lessons that impossible isn't something that cannot be done. And Israel proved it is something that hasn't been done before. So with this, I would like Dr. Newman to introduce Dr. Ido Netanyahu.
Hi there, it's me again. Okay, it's really my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Ido Netanyahu. Let me just say the following. He's a man of so many talents, beginning with being a physician, a radiologist, and then a playwright. He's written a few plays, very successful, world-renowned plays, like, for instance, A Happy End, Worlds in Collision, Meaning, and an author of several books. And I know at least 4 about Entebbe, which is Entebbe, Jonathan Netanyahu's Story, which was published in 2009, Yoni's Last Battle, published in 1991, Sayeret Matkal Be'Entebbe, which would be translated as General Staff Reconnaissance Unit in Entebbe, and the letters of Jonathan Netanyahu, which came out already in 1978. So he has researched the issue of the Entebbe, has taken it to heart, but also to research and science, and come out with findings which were quite amazing when he came out with them about what actually happened during the operation and who really led the battle there. But the main thing about Netanyahu is that he's a wonderful person, humble and modest and a real mensch. So that's my introduction to Netanyahu.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know about the humble part, that doesn't quite fit me, but nevertheless, good to hear about. I thank you, Boaz, very much for your presentation. Some things that I did not know about, and I think a lot of important things that you said. And thank you very much for this presentation. If I was asked to give a quick summary, and I will, it'll be very short. Being the son of a historian, I cannot but help address a few things that I think are not totally accurate, and not your fault. These are things that have simply been talked about and published, and here and there I'd like to make a few minor but maybe important corrections. First of all, it was not just, by the way, I did research the raid. What I did is research mostly the role of the unit, Seyeret Matkal. I had been a member of the unit, and I had access to the people who participated in the raid, who until they talked to me, talked to no one, including the military. And this was many, many years ago. What they remember now, by the way, is different in many ways, because memory is very, as we all know, it can be tricky. And 40 or 45 years later, you tend to see things the way that you heard about them. You don't always see things as they were. And in any case, it was not just Rabin himself as prime minister who on Thursday decided to negotiate with the terrorists in earnest. It was the entire government. It was a governmental decision, a decision made also by then Defense Minister Shimon Peres. It was unanimous because there was no military option to speak of. And the reason there was no military option, and Boaz basically mentioned it, I'd like just to stress it, is that there was no intelligence. You cannot plan anything military-wise without having the minimum bare intelligence, and there was none. And therefore, all those who talk about all these plans that were constructed about Entebbe on Tuesday, on Wednesday, Thursday morning, etc., it's just not true. They might have been ideas, it's true, but not plans. The plans, the important information that enabled the unit to construct its own assault plan was given actually Thursday, I would say in the main, during Thursday night. Now, the person who was responsible for obtaining this information, who knew about how the unit acts and behaves and what it needs, it was a man who was sent to Paris Thursday morning, who arrived there Thursday noon. His name is Amiram Levin. He became a general afterwards, and a day or two later, after Yoni died, he became the commander of the unit. And he certainly knew very well the needs of the unit. And the unit was in constant contact with him over the phone. I have in my possession lists that Yoni himself made that were discovered in the unit 20, 30 years after the raid, that the information that he needed from Amiram Levin in Paris. And that was critical information to enable the unit to plan both the approach to the terminal and the assault on the terminal, okay? That information we did not possess. We possessed it only because of the hostages who were released and were interrogated by the Israelis in Paris. And the main interrogator was actually not the Mossad, although he became head of the Mossad after a while, but actually Amiram Levin, who was then a major in the Israeli army. Now, what's amazing about this operation in terms of the unit is that it was prepared in one day, okay? The planning of the raid was conducted, I'm talking about the units part of the raid, started to be conducted on Thursday evening at 10 o'clock in Yoni's office. And even then, he could not actually plan the assault. He could only plan the approach because he did not yet have the necessary information for the assault. The plan was formulated during the night of Thursday, and the men received their briefing, the major briefing, Thursday late morning. They started rehearsing already Thursday morning. They rehearsed for one day, that's it. And then Thursday evening, at night, the chief of staff came to see this model rehearsal and gave his approval for the raid. His name was Mota Gur, a very daring man, and a very daring chief of staff to give his approval. He was against it at the beginning, but he was convinced otherwise, either from what he saw, or from pressure, or from both. And so nobody in the unit, I did not speak to one single officer who believed on Thursday that this will take place. Nobody. But Thursday night, midnight, 1 o'clock, they hear that Mota Gur will give his recommendation to the chief of staff. Mota Gur had sat with Yoni, by the way, before the rehearsal, after the rehearsal, sat with other officers, of course. Everybody was for it. I'm talking about officers of the various units. And so when they heard that, they said, well, we're just not prepared. This is crazy. We rehearsed one day for an operation of this kind, flying thousands of miles away. There's no way this will succeed. This will be a failure for the land, for the country of Israel, not just for us, not just for our men. It'll be a total failure. And they actually was more dramatic than what you might hear. They actually decided to go behind Yoni's back. And one of them was the son of the minister in the inner cabinet, himself a former general. He'll go home and tell his father that the unit is not prepared and to not even think about doing the raid. He started off, he got out of the unit, but then got cold feet for one reason or another and returned to the unit. Now, Friday morning, Yoni heard that there was, I would say, discontent or lack of ease among the men. What they say now that told you, Boaz, that they told the people, Yoni, that they're not willing to do it, that's not true. Okay, they might remember it that way. They felt ill at ease, and Yoni convened them in a room in the unit for an hour. They discussed everything, and from what they told me, they felt much better about the operation after this session that they had, this hour-long session. And it was not really the high command of the unit. These were officers, okay? These were lieutenants who were squad commanders of the unit, several of them. The higher ranking officers, such as Yoni, such as his deputy, Yiftach Reicher, Yiftach Altir, such as others, were actually did not have this feeling, perhaps because they were more experienced. And this is what's amazing about the raid, the lack, I would say. I think Jacob said it, but in a different way. Really, what he said is, when there is a will, there is a way, and that's absolutely true about this case. Yes, and what they said afterwards is the Yoni believed in their ability more than they themselves did. Yoni knew that they did not have long to prepare, just a few hours of rehearsal, but he knew that the unit was very good, the men were very good, he trusted in them, and he trusted also in himself, and believed this had to be done, and this will be successful. And by the way, he had a session, a separate meeting with the defense minister. He was called for a separate meeting Friday afternoon. They met one-on-one, and Peres says that this no doubt, this also influenced him. He asked Yoni the questions. Yoni, he said, was full of confidence, was sure this would succeed. And this, to what extent this affected the government decision or not, is hard to say. Now, just one small additional correction. Not only Israelis stayed in Entebbe. The terrorists also kept those foreigners, those non-Israelis who had a distinctly Jewish look, whether they were with yarmulkes, whether they were wearing the garb of Orthodox people, whether they were with a beard. They were kept at Entebbe too, even though they were not Israeli citizens. And those who also stayed was the Air France crew. They volunteered to stay. the captain of the Air France jet, Michel Bacos, who recently passed away, a very brave man, told his crew, we're staying until the last passenger is released. And they all stayed. Quite amazing also. Okay. All the whole crew, the stewardesses, everybody, they all stayed. That's also quite amazing. And that's how more than 100 passengers were left at Entebbe. Now, the new terminal, by the way, is fairly removed from the old terminal. If you go there, you can see it's about a mile away. I don't know what this woman saw from the new terminal, but she could not see much. She might have seen Ugandan soldiers surrounding the terminal. She could not know where the hostages were kept. And as a matter of fact, by the way, the unit assumed the hostages were kept in the two rooms. They assumed probably they were all kept in one big room, even though the Israelis were kept in a smaller room, in a smaller hall, but they assumed the forces were divided by Yoni in such a way that they would simultaneously enter those two halls where they had been kept. And of course, the big factor was the Ugandan army, how many soldiers there would be. And what enabled the go-ahead for the operation was the Mossad reconnaissance photos that were taken and that showed that there was not a big Ugandan force surrounding the terminal, just a few soldiers. Most of them were inside the building on the second floor, as Boaz mentioned. And those photos, which arrived in Israel very late Saturday, just before takeoff, that showed this, gave the chief of staff, he said, I'm giving the final okay for the mission. The government then still had a session of many hours until they decided while the force was in the air that they will approve the mission. Otherwise, they would have headed back. So I think my summary of this is just that I would say the unit and the other units that did other things in the raid, and certainly Shiki Shani, whom you saw in that video that you brought, the commander of the Hercules squadron, they were all intent on doing this mission. There's no way we're going to stop. We'll do it. We have to do it. And so this epitomizes, I think, what Israel is all about, okay? Saving its citizens because we have the ability and the force to do it, whereas not too long ago we couldn't. And that is my brief summary. And thank you all very much. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Ido. I appreciate that. And I'm always looking to sharpen my knowledge and sharpen my
I'm sorry, I have one favor to, there was somebody who asked me here, who wrote me that her son, Eitan, who's 16 years old, is into Entebbe and is reading my book, and she wanted me to greet him, so I am greeting Eitan, and I hope you enjoy the book. Sorry, go ahead, continue.
How nice. No, what I'm saying is I appreciate any and all corrections and dialogue around that. I think that from what I heard, a lot of it has to do with me not having a lot of time to explain. So of course I know that the cabinet made the decision.
No, I'm not faulting you. I'm just trying to clarify a few things.
No, I want to clarify when we say corrections, it's not I was not given the time to be able to explain every detail. Sure. So yes, of course, it was a unanimous decision by the cabinet to go ahead. It wasn't Yitzhak Rabin being renegade, going on his own, etc. And yes, of course, the Mossad agent was able to get close to the old terminal. I can spend a lot of time, talking about what information I have, what information I'm missing about that. The one point, though, that you brought up that I would say is a correction to me, versus I just didn't have enough time to explain. I agree with you on all those, is the part about when did the officers talk to Yoni and what did they say to him? And that I'm glad you told me, because I did hear something different than you, so I'm going to go back and try to nail that down. Yes.
By the way, another small correction there. Look, there are many details. Israel, Solel Bonet did not build the old terminal. Okay.
Well, that's again.
Let me just say it. Okay, tell you the facts. This is another thing. I know it's being said everywhere in all the books. It said the old terminal was a typical English colonial terminal. Israel did not have any plans of the old terminal. So they built a new terminal, not the terminal, but they built a new runway. And the construction, the build of the old terminal was provided by people who had remembered it, who were interviewed, as well as, of course, by those who were interviewed in Paris. But Israel had many people a few years before who went through the old terminal many times, and they provided sort of a sketching. And you see the sketches, they're very, very primitive. What the unit had was very primitive sketches. These were not, I would say, architectural sketches of any kind.
And I would say, if you go back, this is being recorded, so you can go back and see exactly what I said. And what I said about Solel Boneh is there are these rumors about it. I don't know what's true. But even if it is true, that's what I said. I said there's these rumors. People say, I don't know if it's true or not true. But even if it was true, it's insufficient.
Hey, sorry. Let's see if there's any questions from all the people that were so patiently listened to. And thank you again, Dr. Netanyahu, for clarifying and accepting our invitation and being part of this program. And anybody that has any questions, raise your hand and we'll let you. Go ahead. Alina.
Put in the chat. Basically, what I observed is that when President Trump was president, I saw my Jewish friends waving the flag with what would have been, neo-Nazis, and, the alignments were very pro-Israel. And then all of a sudden now, it seems that the public opinion it's very easy to sway public opinion. It's swayed to some extent in the other direction. The reason why is because people are so completely uneducated. So it just depends on what they hear. So I'm wondering, what can we do as leaders in the community to sway public opinion pro-Israel? What are there any films we can be given, information? Not necessarily all the specifics, because people they're stupid. Most people are dumb. We're just dumb. I'm just going to say it. They're dumb. I got to dumb everything out. So what do we do? What do we do?
I'm not the right guy to answer the question.
Anybody?
Everybody on his own can be his own ambassador in support of Israel. That's all he can do. Yeah. And we have a consul general. They have, but any more specific to Dr. Netanyahu or to the consul general or to Boaz?
I would love a copy of any films. I have followers all over the world.
Okay, so thank you, Alina.
Post.
Yeah, Jacob, I'm going to jump in here because Consul General knows what I'm going to talk about next. I'm a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and I also teach in the Merage programs. I have taken my executive MBA classes now to Israel 2 times directly and 1 time virtually. We just went virtually, was at Hillel 6 or 7 weeks ago. The point that I want to make here is, to answer your question, Alina, is education that is delivered in a way that is expanding people's minds. This is my class in global business, not just focused on Israel, but Israel is a part of the global economy. And to show them in the area where we are really strong, I'm Jewish, by the way, in innovation, in entrepreneurship, and all the various things we can do, is broaden those students' minds. And I have found over the last few years, as we've begun going to Israel and with my work with the Merage Foundation and Institute, is we've been able to give that message in a very interesting, objective way. And so I think that's another way to do this. And we do it across the university campuses where we can begin saying, we take our executive MBAs in most large business schools on international residentials. Israel has not been the top spot in the world. A lot of people, as I did for many years, take them to China because that's where the economic development's happening. But to bring them to Israel, to give them the experience of a week of innovation and entrepreneurship, of working with an incredible amount of American companies that are already there with their accelerators and incubators. And we find that every time I go, there's more and more people want the students to come. I think that's been very helpful. And I'm very grateful to the Merage Foundation and to Hillel and a number of other people that have helped us do that.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Judge Kozinski, thanks for joining us. Any comments from you?
No, it's all very interesting, and of course I remember Entebbe, and I was very glad to hear the details.
Yeah, it was very. Anybody else before we call it for today? Christy, you want to say a few words on behalf of Merage? I'll say my closing statement. I said it before and I'll repeat it again. When I said that impossible is something that hasn't been done before, and this is the story of Israel.
Jacob, this is Brent. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, Brent.
Sorry, the internet connection is poor. I'm from United States Special Operations Command. In the aftermath of Operation Thunderbolt, were there any lessons that the government of Israel or the IDF decided to change to improve? It was a very successful raid. Congratulations. But just like the parallel that Boaz did with Operation Eagle Claw for the US that we did, we had a catastrophic failure. We learned the lesson and created United States Special Operations Command. So were there any lessons that Israel did and changed after the mission? Over.
Well, so here's one. It may sound subtle, but it's important. So Sayeret Matkal was not an anti-terrorism unit. This was a functional commander unit of the Israeli military that did all sorts of missions, for the military on its own. And in fact, the week of the hostage crisis, a good chunk of the unit was in the Sinai carrying out a military operation, a different kind of strategic operation. And they had started to develop anti-terrorism as a function of that. Muki Betzer led that part, but it was not the central theme for the Sayeret Matkal. And I think following, just like the rest of the West, from Germany to the United States to France, realize we can make better use of special operation forces in the war against terror. So did Israel start to, accentuate that a little bit more as well. Israel has, the problem of terrorism, but unfortunately, going back, to its very beginning, Israel has many other military challenges as well. And so how do you fit that in and make sure you keep your priorities, where they need to be? Maybe today it's a higher priority. I don't know. I'm not as versed with what's going on today. But I do know that back in the 70s, Israel was still facing, in 1976, enemies on all sides. Military, threats, serious military threats on all sides, everywhere they looked, including to the south. And terrorism, as bad as it was, and it was bad in the 70s, was actually not the number one threat to Israel's strategic existence at the time. But Entebbe gave Israel the confidence to sharpen that and accentuate that a little bit more.
Great.
Thank you.
Christy, anything else before we say thank you to everybody?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today. And I'd like to give a special thanks to, of course, Jacob Siegel. Thank you. Consul General Newman, Boaz, and Dr. Netanyahu. Thank you so much. Been wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Netanyahu. Thank you very much for honoring and with your open discussion, comments. Every time I hear the story, my blood goes like this. I don't know of any other country that will send their best sons 2,500 miles to go and be and rescue them. So it is, in my mind, one of the greatest rescue missions in history. Thank you, Boaz, for the work you did on behalf of the Operation Entebbe. Thank you all for joining us. Toda rabah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.